Hi there, welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. Great to have you here with us on the show today. For those of you who are new to the show, what is the show all about? Well, the show is all about raising awareness, influencing behaviour, and fostering an organisational culture where information security and data protection are truly valued. So where did the idea for the show come from? Well, it's really spun out of 7.5 years research that I've been doing into why people do what they do when we've asked them not to. That's right, the human factor when it comes to information security and data protection. And as part of all that research, I was absolutely blown away by how very quickly I realised that the whole range of disciplines, skills, experience, data sets, which were not really commonly discussed or available within the information security and data protection space. And so I set out about trying to bring those insights to the discussion within the industry. And the podcast is one of those platforms that I do that. Yeah, the way that I do that is for book and through training courses and speaking events as well. So what is it you're going to get out of the show today? Well, today we've got a guest on who has worked both within the finance sector and the health sector, government sector, but has always had an absolute focus upon, the challenges of, how do I raise awareness amongst a target audience, with the objective being to bring around changes in behaviour, and then taking into consideration the implications of culture on both the awareness piece and the behavioural piece. And this person has been working for an organisation that I think, has been more ahead of the curve and many of the organisations out there. And so, she's got some real experience about how they've been bringing around changes in sort of awareness and behaviour within her own organisation. And so it's absolutely great to have her on the show today. So without any further ado, let's get on with the interview. Prudence, hi. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, the first thing we ask all our guests to do is just explain to all our listeners a little bit about Prudence Smith, who you are, what you're up to, and the journey that you've been on in relation to the human factor.
Well, thanks very much. I've had a particularly interesting career today in how I got into cyber and information security and how long I've been in it. I originally attended the first InfoSec conference back in 1995 when it was in a hangar in Wembley, when it consisted of about 5 vendors and some scantily clad women.
Things have changed. Things have changed.
Sorry?
Things have definitely changed.
Well, they certainly have. Not so much on the scantily clad women, but I hear that there are scantily clad men around nowadays. So at least we've got some level over there. This is when information security was a made-up job. Cyber meant Cybermen from Cyber Who. From Doctor Who, and security by obscurity was a valid method of security. Throughout my career, I've been particularly working on transparency, so talking about getting people to understand a situation that they're in, and that drew me a long time ago over to security, and I've been pretty much doing that for the last 25 odd years, 30 years. Getting people to understand their input into security, because as we all know, security is always an add-on. And so we've always been doing a catch-up when it comes to security awareness and securing our systems and our data. And that's what's really taken my interest. I've delivered a number of projects across multiple firms and organizations, pretty much put my hand in most things from service desk operations to risk reviews to organizing penetration tests. So it certainly is an interesting career. And the one thing that has been consistently missed throughout my career has been the human angle of that. And it's that whole point that we can put in all the controls that we can put in, but it will take one person with their finger and an email who can take down all of that protection that we put in place. And that really is the main focus of security at the moment while we're trying to secure access to our data.
That's really interesting. So you're sort of saying, obviously you've been involved in InfoSec for, my gosh, I'm awful at maths, but I can do the maths now. You've been involved in it longer than I have.
Probably in one shape or form.
Well, I think it was 1998 I got involved in it. And back then, it was I think they were calling it, they wouldn't even call it InfoSec, they wouldn't call it IT security. And very quickly I was like, I'm not really sure about that. It's about information, isn't it? So I called it information security. But yeah, but it's interesting. You see, you've been involved in quite for some time. You were talking there about the various projects that you've been involved with, a variety of different organizations. And the one thing you say you're pulling out is people weren't looking at the human factor as part of those projects. They weren't looking at the human factor as a standalone project, and they weren't looking at its role in relation to, all these other projects that you're on. And you were like, hold on, this is a really big piece that's missing from the puzzle.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's the authorization, isn't it? How can you prevent something that's been authorized by an end user?
So when did it become your focus? I mean, as in you took a role or you took responsibility for a project where bringing around changes or in levels of awareness or changes in behavior or culture. When did that start to be when does somebody do that rugby pass to you, go, here you go, take this by hands?
But I remember it well.
All right, you were suddenly crushed. Okay.
It was back in 2014, and that's when the company I was then working for suddenly saw this massive area. We saw that it was consistently that we could see that, and this is consistent across all organizations about the end user. And so they took a proactive approach to it and wanted to take it to a risk-based, holistic method of training and awareness that would change not only the culture of how we treat cybersecurity internally with our customers and our clients and our colleagues and our suppliers, but also wider society. We've got ourselves in a situation here. I mean, I remember, as we say, when I'm showing my age here, back in 1995, the organisation I was working for at the time, we had standalone systems. And then we had the internet, and that was in a room, and everybody went in there to go and have a look at the internet. And then we had one email address. Then everybody wanted local admin rights because they wanted everything that's, they wanted to put on any application that they wanted onto their desktop. Then they wanted email addresses. Then they wanted the internet. And then all of a sudden, all of our desktop data, unless it's completely secured, is exposed over the internet. And we've got that catch-up game to do. And so it's about changing our attitude in everything that we do. We've got to be aware that it's not somebody else's problem. It's our own problem, and we've got to own our own data and our access.
So the first thing I'm loving is when somebody says, and the internet was in a room, and I'm like going... That's so long ago. That's brilliant. Like, yes, there is this massive thing called the internet, and it's in this room, and you're like, oh, walk in, and you look around the room, and you're looking to find this internet, and you go, oh, there's a terminal, and that's it. And you're like, how disappointed am I?
Yes, it was very disappointing, especially when you had the dial-up.
Oh, God, yeah, okay, yes.
I am going back somewhat. But
I know, but I love that. Oh, that was absolutely fantastic. But when I think of the internet, it was like, that's where the internet is. I remember first I got internet access, and again, it was just like, it was special. It wasn't ubiquitous. You didn't have access to it on your phone, your laptop. You didn't actually have a phone necessarily, or a laptop.
True.
So all the things we now take for granted back in 1995, they were just really, really rare assets. So, the first thing was, can I even access the asset that gives me access to the internet in a way? So, and that creates a different situation. I think it's actually an interesting point that, looking at awareness and behavior and culture in that context would be very different to looking at it now.
Yes. Absolutely. And it's because of that attitude and the way that we took it on, which is why security is an add-on, which is why we're in the mess we're in at the moment.
The whole thing was designed around access, wasn't it? It wasn't designed around secured access. And this is the thing where I really struggle sometimes. I go, secured access. I'm like, well, actually, shouldn't it just be access? And part of that should be about security. But unless you actually draw a line between I've got access and then the secure access, i.e. I've got access to what it is that I specifically need to have access to. For example, these are my information assets, or these are the things I've been given permission to have access to. But it's really important that you draw those distinctions between them. So Okay, so that was the first thing I loved. The second thing about that project, this was back in 2014, was this anything to do with the consequences book?
No, it actually came out of an external audit.
Okay.
Of all places. So that's what kicked it off. But you could tell that there was a general move in that area about the humans. People had been talking about it for some time.
Yeah.
And, you had these issues that were happening, such as Society Generale issue with the system accounts and such like. That there was a real, there was more focus generally going to the end user. And the controls that they needed to have implemented. So it was a sort of double-barreled approach, and that with the evolving regulations that were happening, that were changing more to, end users, all users have to understand cyber and information security, and when they're in an incident, and I think that's the most important thing. Do you know when you're in an incident, and do you know what to do?
Yeah. So because you were in a highly regulated market, weren't you?
Fortunately, yes.
Yeah, and the regulator was becoming more mature about how they were seeing the potential problem, and one of those areas that they were looking at was, hold on here, we put all these controls in place, but actually at the end of the day, people are still given a degree of choice and freedom of choice about whether or not they comply with the policy. They do the training, etc., but they still ultimately have to make a decision about whether or not they want to do it.
Absolutely.
And so they were recognizing that and then saying, well, we need to do more here.
Absolutely. I mean, the regulations are just backing up what we already know. In order to understand a situation, in order to know what to do in a situation, you need to understand that at least you're in a situation in the first place.
By in a situation, you mean basically what it means to be human in a way. Yeah. Yes. And that is overlooked. When we talk about awareness, for example, now this is the bit of I'm going to use the word bugbear. It sounds so negative, but it's one of the things that came out of my own research is, as an industry, we focus on awareness, but actually what we talk about is awareness of the employees or the contractors or our suppliers. And actually one of the important things about awareness, even from a mindfulness perspective, which is an important issue which businesses are grappling with and people are grappling with day in, day out, is your own self-awareness. How aware are we as security professionals or responsible for education? How aware are we of actually what it is we need to be achieving and our own abilities in that particular area? So I think this interpretation of the word awareness, it's often about just employees, and it's like, how aware are we as individuals driving this? How aware are we of what the challenge is, and maybe how we're not necessarily stepping up to mark? And it's the same for regulators. Because I had an interesting conversation in the previous episode where we looked at the Data Protection Act, or GDPR. Okay, and you've got the same going on over in the US and Japan and China, lots of regulations going out about personal data. And a lot of them are talking about education and awareness. And I just wonder how much of a rod that's creating for the back of the individual team responsible for bringing around change. Because education and awareness aren't necessarily behavior and culture. You can just, and I just wonder whether or not, and it'd be great to get your view on this, whether or not you think that the regulators are great and they're supportive, but sometimes the language they use, if people they interpret it as education and awareness, when actually the objective is to bring around changes in behavior and culture, are they missing a trick?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitions when it comes to training and awareness, I think having worked in a number of teams that's dealing with training and awareness, sometimes even the teams themselves forget about the difference between training, education and awareness. I mean, they are three very distinct different things addressing different areas of focus, but they have some overlap. But let's not forget that awareness is difficult to measure. It's like people do posters all the time, don't they? People love a poster. But how do you gauge that? How do you gauge the effectiveness of that? You can look at the research that happens and you can see there has been some research about where people's eyes go when they go into an office and such like. And there have been reports that people don't look at the posters at all. But then you can have a look at different research and say, well, if you put enough posters up and you keep repeating the same things over and over again, then, that is an effective method of spreading the message.
So actually, it's interesting what you're saying there. If you put the posters up enough times consistently, then they're more likely to almost be triggered in people's perspective. They start to recognize those posters, which is it's interesting because in the world of advertising, what they'll talk about is when they run an advert, running an advert once, will attract a certain degree of attention. But the recommended number of times you should run an advert is something like 3. So the highest number, you're more likely to get more attention over 3 than you are 1. And it's something to do with consistency. So delivering at the same point, on the same day, at the same time, in the same format, for example, is more likely to actually create an impression on an individual. So one of the things that when we set up the podcast in the early days, possibly because I was trying to do way too much, I was trying to, earn a living as well as do the podcast. Sometimes the podcast wouldn't come out on the same day, and it would end up coming out in different days in the week. And what we noticed was actually the level of interaction was different. And we basically swallowed our own dog food here because we consistently talk about getting the message out at consistent periods of time so people know when to expect that. And so one thing we really worked hard upon this series is to make sure the podcast is delivered on the same day. And we're looking at how that has an impact in terms of the amount of engagement with not just the podcast, but all the supporting materials like the blogs that we do and the Q&A sessions and all that. And it's interesting. We're only like, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through the series, but actually it's interesting to see the higher levels of engagement.
Absolutely. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. And this correlates exactly to information security and cyber awareness. What I've been doing, I've been in this industry for a long time. We are still saying the same things as what we were saying at the beginning. Secure your data, secure your access to it, recertify. We're still saying the same things. Now, the point about that is that we need to be training people from the day they're born so that when they come into the organisation, they are fully trained up on all of the risks that are happening in their environment. We've got iPads in schools, we've got fake news happening, we've got trolling and bullying. These are the things that need to be embedded into children so that when they're going to school, they're completely aware of what the risks, the adversaries are one step ahead. They want to be one step ahead, and we've got to keep up with that. And if we want to keep our safe, our assets, our people, our families safe, our friends and all of that, we've got to take that forward approach onto that. And so when the users come into the organisation, we can actually start talking to them about the risk issues that they're going to have that are going to directly affect them. So say they're an operations person or they're working in the finance team. They are going to be hit particularly on days that they are doing payroll runs or specific runs. People have got to remember that they know when you're going to do this. You've got to always think that the adversaries are always in there. I think it's always a good way to think that. If you think they're always in there, you always take that little secondary approach. I know that I can talk about this in a sort of, idealistic viewpoint because I've been working in this field for so long, but we do need to make this second nature. So I think everybody who has access to a system and even not access to a system, because it is about people using the information that they find online and using that to get the information or in order for them to do what they want to do. So talking in a roundabout sort of way, we've got to change the attitude of how we treat our data and our access, and that needs to start from birth.
Now, that's really, listeners, that's really, really important. And it was something that came out of my own work is from a cultural perspective. We talk within organizations, they talk about trying to change the organizational culture to embed information security into the organizational culture. And actually, you listen to the interviews that we've done with Gert-Jan Hofstede in series 1 and 2. One of the key things that we always come back to, and I love having these conversations with people, and they go, but the fact of the matter is the 20,000 people in your workforce or the 30 people in your workforce, before they joined your organization,
majority of their cultural values had already been developed and embedded in them through their lives, from the date of birth all the way to the point where they've maybe finished school or finished college, and then they've gone and joined the workforce. And actually, if you really want to get the cultural piece done, you've got to do what Prudence is basically saying, which is we've got to be raising awareness and influencing behavior and embedding something within the societal culture, okay, so that basically the workforce of the future is already up to speed, and that actually, in effect, what our responsibilities are as education and awareness professionals within security, within organization, is to maintain that momentum and the quality of their knowledge and levels of awareness, etc. I think this is so very, very important, which is why I think the organization that you are working for, Prudence, in the UK, basically, they run a lot of public awareness campaigns on TV and through other media. And the one thing I've always highlighted that organization as being an organization which is truly thinking ahead of the game. They recognize that actually they're going to be employing people from the UK and from further afield. If you can start educating those people as part of your brand then about the importance of privacy and security to help them as individuals in society, when they apply for a job with your organization, they're already recognizing that you folks take it seriously. I think what your organization did was pretty marvelous. Really, really, I highlight that to people. That that audit in a way drove this change, and that also incorporated the understanding that you talk about, like the importance within a society perspective. I just want to highlight that because for me it was a great extension of the strategy into society, recognizing that in effect society in the end becomes your workforce, and that's who's going to be securing your systems, their data, etc. So I say bravo to you guys.
Thank you very much. It was a very exciting time with all that, because we were really breaking the ground and on what we were doing here. So it involved a lot of research. When we first looked into that, I had to look around and started looking at what do we know about user behaviour, and there was hardly anything around. And one thing that the UK government was suggesting at the time was that firms and organisations took up public messaging, and that really stuck with me. And the one thing that I really, people don't understand when it comes to finance is PIN numbers, and people are sharing PIN numbers and they think it's fine. And what they don't understand, and this is how the first adverts came up, was a conversation about PIN numbers. And it's like, and it started with a conversation such as, why does nobody know that they have to keep their PIN numbers to themselves? If you want somebody to have access to your bank account, just get them their own PIN number. It's as simple as that. And it's getting that understanding. And this to me is basic financial stuff, basic financial know-how. There's an advert on television at the moment. I'm not sure whether I can say this, but there's an advert on television at the moment for a banking group in the UK. And it concerns me a little bit because what it says in this advert, it says, we do not call you up and ask you to transfer your money to a different account. Now, I think that's very dangerous because no bank would ask you to do that. And I think it has the potential to tell people that they may not do it, but other banks may do it. Well, it's not actually standard process to go around doing that. It's something that the adversaries have locked into, that people take into account. If somebody called me up and started asking me to transfer my money to another account because some money's coming out of it, I wouldn't believe it for a second. But it's this sort of information that needs to get across. And I think we need to be careful about our messages. So, there are a lot of messages out there. And I think we need to repeat those messages. We don't need to keep recreating what the standard messages are. We need to be saying the same thing over and over again. As I go back to my point about posters, it's about that repetition that will eventually get into people's minds. I mean, culture change does take time. Fortunately, at the organisation, we did it really ahead of time, and it's about that culture change. How do you monitor that culture change? Especially if you put a lot of effort into it, how do you monitor that? But it does, I managed to take it, we sped it up, but it does take 10 years at least to make a culture change across an organisation.
And I'm just going to pull that out, everybody listening, 10 years. Because and when I say that, I'll send it like this, 10 years. Actually, that's exciting because one thing that I come across when talk to people, they're talking about culture change. So we'd like to change the culture, and they turn around and then you say, and what timescales are we thinking of here? And they're like, a year, 2 years, maybe at a stretch 3. And I'm like, okay, so this is the point where I'm not interested in this project any longer because it's completely unrealistic.
Setting up to fail. I mean, you can make some changes within that time frame. I mean, I've certainly done that, but you've got to get, in order for that to happen, you need to have a complete focus on security. Security is your number one issue. You've got that from the chairman through the board, and everybody is taking that on board, and it is your number one risk. If you take it on, yes, you can do that in 3 years.
So you just mentioned the word risk, okay? So I'm just going to pull you in on that particular one, and going a little bit further back to, when we first started talking, we talked about risk-based profiling. So this is something I'm seeing a lot more of. I talk to people and I'm like, okay, do you take a risk-based approach to how you do your work around the human factor? And a lot of people sort of like are increasingly saying yes. So there's this maturity of people like this. So just training everybody, they're doing this risk-based profiling. And this is something that you've had some exposure to quite some time ago. But what's your view on risk-based profiling?
I think you have to be very careful with it. I think you can, when you're profiling, that's always looking at the middle option, isn't it? You are going to make some messes with that. But what you've got to remember, you've always got to have a starting point. So, let's make this an accessible, easy route in. Let's not try and take too much on at the beginning. Looking at an organisation, the first thing you need to do is to just go, right, okay, does everybody in my organisation know what to do in an incident? That is the main issue. Do they know how to respond? Do they run away from an incident? There are certain people that do that, and they are going to be a part of that organisation. Do they know what to do? I thought I did. In some organisations I've gone to, and then in the panic, they don't know what to do. So that's a really good method to start to think about what general awareness do I need to know. Now, you can easily work that out just by doing, say, a phishing test, and you can get an organisation to do that for you safely. And that's just to understand, do you actually have the exercise to show that you do know what would happen in an incident? And then, so I think you do need to start on that. Let's not make it impossible, but then you need to start looking at your finance. Your finance, who's got access to your data, who's got access to your financial systems, who can make payments, and look at the bigger nuts first, crack those, get them locked down so they don't have access to everything. They've got reduced permissions. It's going to be a whole gamut of exercises, what you do to control access around these people. You've got to tell them, you've got to look at what the intel is out there, about what you know about the systems that you're using. What do they try and find out, what the adversaries know about you, what's happening with your patching systems, where is that? Are you fully up to speed on that? And then, go further down the risk profiling. When you start, if you're a big enough organization or you can get access to an organization who has intelligence, you can get the intelligence about what's happening with people like yourselves. Companies like what you are doing, and understand. So if they're being hit by, say, an invoice fraud, then you would know that one is coming down the road to you. So you could send that awareness across to your employees to say, hey, look out for this. So I see it very much as a journey. I don't have the problem with risk profiling, but I think, as with all risk assessors, there is a risk that you will miss some things. What I've noticed in the past is that when I'm trying to identify their most high-risk users, it fluctuates between everybody in the firm to very few in the firm. And I think it's probably, like most things, it's going to be a happy medium.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you used the word adversary a few times, but you're sort of hitting on a point which I think was a aha moment, and I don't mean the banned originally from.
I like that.
They did a couple of good tracks. The adversary bit, for me, one of the biggest moments in my research, I had this aha moment. I was like, aha! So that would explain. Understanding these behavioural pieces would mean I now understand, why attackers design phishing campaigns in that way. And you've mentioned the adversary, but understanding, we tend to respond to what the adversary is doing, But the adversary is basing their sort of approaches. They're not just second guessing here. These people are actually really well informed. They understand how behaviors are formed and influenced, and they design their approaches with that in mind.
Yes, I put some money into some research at a university, and that was looking at user behavior and how end users react in certain situations. And what they found is that people are really fickle, and they will change their security posture at a moment's notice if they've had an argument with their boss, or say they've had an argument with their partner or their child. It can have an impact on about how somebody deals with security. And that's really important, because that will understanding that will design the systems better so that we can safeguard our end users from finding themselves under attack.
That's interesting. I mean, just recently I was watching some online training content, and one of the areas I cover is the importance of the actual environment within which you're making a choice, a decision. So it's like choice architecture related stuff, and you're sort of pointing out that there is this whole range of things in the environment that you have little or no control over as the person responsible for awareness, behaviour, and culture from a security data protection perspective. But actually, it's really important to recognise them. That you know, if there's a fallout between your employee and a member of their family or their partner or boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, at that moment in time, or even for a period of time afterwards, people are pumped up. Even the concept for me is like, okay, so suddenly they're feeling stressed, cortisol's being released, cortisol has an impact upon the brain, which has this impact in terms of moving you from being a logical thinker to somebody who's just basically using, again, think of it, the gut instinct. I think for all the times that happens within people's lives, any of those could be around about the same time as somebody finding themselves in the situation where they have to make a decision about whether or not they want to comply with the policy. And that results in, like you say, people being fickle. And so, that's really interesting that you knew. How big a piece of research was that? Was it smallish scope, or was it relatively large?
It was pretty small, but as I say, we've got to take our research where we can find it, and pull it together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that we struggle. I mean, even when I was doing most of my research, and I guess one of the reasons why we invite people from outside of the security industry is that when it comes to awareness, behaviour, and culture, a lot of this stuff has been done outside, but very, very, very small amounts have been actually done specifically within the context of information security and cybersecurity.
I just wanted to talk about one more thing about data.
Okay, go for it.
In 2018, Which did a report about consumer attitudes to data collection and use, which I thoroughly recommend people take a look at. And what that did, it was conducted over the UK, and it put people into how there are 4 different types of people. Well, there are 8 different types of people, but there are 4 different types of people in how they treat their online data. And I think it's very important in those that are especially designing our systems and our architecture that is read up upon so that there is some actual research. And this came out just as the Cambridge Analytica issues came out. So it was really good timing on their part. So I do recommend that. Look at that. It was Which and Britain Thinks. Okay. And it's called Control, Alt, Delete, or Delete.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's interesting because you mentioned about Cambridge Analytica. One of the things for me, actually, when my partner sort of flagged it up for me first, and she's obviously been exposed to, hey, guess what I've just learned today? My poor partner has to put up with that quite a lot. And then suddenly, when you get to understand that, then you start to understand. Then she mentioned about Cambridge Analytica, and I'm like, yeah, and this is why. Because of the, you understand that how behaviors are formed and influenced, and then how people are incorporating that into their business model.
Yes.
And their business is all about information. In the case of Cambridge Analytica, it's about ultimately informing people about how to bring around changes in behavior, in that case, for the gain of, from a voting perspective, for example. But that's been applied everywhere. And I know we've got an interview with a guest later on in this series where they spoke about their own personal research, working for one of the big analyst companies, where they looked at what was going on in terms of design, Facebook.
Yes.
And it's interesting because when you spoke to that individual, and then you look at Cambridge Analytica and you go all the way back to where it all came from. It sort of all comes down to this understanding of how behaviors are formed and influenced. And hey, that's what the adversary's understanding, and that's how they're designing their attack. And the question is, do we want to constantly be chasing people, or do we want to get a step ahead of the game, or at least on a level where we start to think, okay, how are behaviors formed and influenced, and how can we sort of design that into how we design the overall architecture of our organization?
Absolutely.
Purity. Yeah. So no, brilliant point. Thank you for raising that. So Prudence, I've got a question for you. When people take on a job, or I can imagine that somebody's working in an organization and their boss comes up to them and says, hey, we'd like you to take responsibility for the education and awareness piece within the organization, or bringing around changing culture. Or alternatively, if you respond to an advert for a job role that looks interesting, you're looking for maybe, you've done governance, risk and compliance for years, and you're trying to think about something which is really interesting to get into. There's going to be another interesting feather to your cap. And you look at education and awareness, you see a job role which says, security, awareness and culture. How important is it that you're clear about what awareness, behavior and culture actually means?
That's a very good question, Bruce. I think what's important is that people need to understand where their organisation is in the training and awareness sphere. That will give you a gauge. Sorry, Bruce. Sorry, what did you say?
In terms of their maturity.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's the first port of call. I mean, what you'll find when you start working with the comms team, and you start, if you're working in a large organisation, because it's imperative that you get the comms team on side. I think that's going to be one of your first port of calls, is potentially get a survey out there. That's a very good way to gauge what people are thinking at the end user level. What I've managed to do is, in different organisations, is that I put the surveys within existing surveys. So existing ones that are out there, so that we're not burdening our users with more. And that will give you a good level understanding about where you are right there. And then I think you need to know, the main thing is incident response, and do you know when you're in an issue?
Now, if you were to go to an interview for a role which said security culture, okay, and you got to the interview and the interviewer wasn't able to answer the question of what they meant by culture, what would that send alarm bells ringing, or would you think, that's an opportunity for me to define what culture actually means?
No, I don't think that's actually imperative that they know what they want from the culture, because that's why they're coming to you in the first place. What you need to demonstrate if you're going in there to show culture change and to show a change to the cyber and information security stance, you've got to take that roadmap in there. You've got to have your idea about how you're going to secure that firm, and you need to be selling that and showing the metrics to show that change in culture, and that's going to be a full product. Yes, you can join an organisation and start, smaller organisations, and start making some changes there. Absolutely, there's no harm in that. But just start looking at where you want to go to. Start looking at the framework. I think that don't get too hooked up on the definition, because we're still very early on in user behaviour and cyber and information security in that respect. So don't get too hooked up on that, but have a clear idea of what your end goal is. For example, if you want to stop people clicking on links and losing money in a certain area, then you need to be focusing on that rather than the definitions itself.
Right, okay. Now, something that's a hot topic at the moment is the coronavirus outbreak. I suspect it's going to be with us for a little while now. What impact does such an event have on the person that's responsible for education and awareness within an organization? It's a big question. I think a lot of people are going through it. But
Yes.
in your mind, what sort of things that spring to your mind about the challenges that such a sort of strategic event has?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that, in the cyber and information security field that this activity kicks off adversary reactions. So, we're going to be a heightened risk at the moment. Most organizations will be because we're concerned about different areas. We've got concerns about our family. Our minds are in different areas. So I think the main thing that you would need to do when you're thinking about training awareness is get some messages out there. It's about the comms. Get that out there as early as possible. Get some about be aware, look what's happening, show some examples of what the organization is being hit with while this is going on so people can prepare themselves. Don't put links in any emails that you're sending out. Make things very easy to find and put all the information that you have in there. And that's just to make everybody aware because, they do use areas such as this. And I've already seen a couple of things that are happening on the internet over this, especially about you've got house party and you've got Zoom hijacking that's going on. And people are going to use these technologies because they're easy to communicate with other people. And we've got to take into account that the adversaries realise that and they're going to attack those systems that people are using. The best way I find to actually get people to understand their cyber and information security responsibilities is show them. It really is as simple as showing what information people can glean about you from the internet and then showing it back to you in a presentation, or having a word with you. It is about, identifying those issues and displaying it back to you so you can make that honest decision.
Right, Prudence, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us on the show. I'm looking down here at my list of notes. It's 3 pages long. So you've given me a load of homework to do. But yeah, absolutely fantastic to have your show. I hope that you've enjoyed it.
I thoroughly have. Thank you so much, Bruce.
It's really great to have you on. I'm pretty confident that the listeners will have taken away a lot from that as well. And so I really appreciate the fact that you've given us some of your time as you currently think about what it is that you're up to next. I'm sure somebody's going to be very lucky to get you on board and to help them with how they're addressing the human factor.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure.
Well, I hope you found that conversation there with Prudence Smith really interesting. Like I said, I got really interested in what Prudence is doing within the industry. Initially, it was because, who she was working for. Prudence's views upon the challenges that we face stem from where she currently is. And so it became quite clear that she's quite passionate and very driven by what I call the principles behind human design. And I think it was because she's had those sort of principles in mind and she's applied them to a number of different roles that she's been in. I thought she'd make a great guest. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting. And if you did find that interesting, or you found any of the other insights that we share on the show interesting, how might you save yourself a hell of a lot of time doing all that research? Get some shortcuts to those type of insights. And then, not just the insights, but hey, how can these actually be applied to the world that I'm living in and the challenges that I'm facing within my organization around the human factor? Well, simple way of doing that, I actually run a range of training courses, both face-to-face and online. And we're also kicking off a coaching program for chief information security officers and education awareness managers and information security professionals that have been given this responsibility. And the best way to find out about those, the training courses and the coaching program, is to drop me an email at bruce.hallis@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. And I'll get back to you and let you know what it is that we're up to, and we can see whether or not there's an opportunity for me to share these insights off the back of 7.5 years research, but also really applying what I've learned in a number of organizations around the world now to somewhere in the region of about 180,000 people in 4 different languages. Yeah, please drop me an email. I'd love to hear from you. So who do we have on the show next week? Well, we've got somebody on the show next week who, for me, was the first person that I came across as a CISO who was actually applying behavioural insight to how you develop a strategy and then how you sort of align your operational objectives to that strategic goal to focus around that, not just the education awareness piece, but bringing around behaviour and taking into consideration culture. And really importantly, he was turning that into a success. And for me, that's really important for you to know that. A lot of these insights we were talking about, a lot of people there say, okay, that's academic, that's research for it, etc. But are people actually doing this? And hopefully we've introduced some people in this series that are taking those insights away. But this guest was doing it 4 years ago. And I finally tracked him down and got him on the show. So I tell you what, it's a really, really cracking interview with this individual. So yeah, please don't miss it. It's definitely going to be worth subscribing to the podcast if you're not already subscribed. But if you're already subscribed, please tune in and listen to this one. It's an absolute belter, and it wraps up the end of series 3. And then after that particular episode, we're going to be taking a little bit of a break for, I think, about 4 or 5 weeks. And then we'll be coming back with series 4 of the show with some amazing guests again and some really, really interesting insights. We've really thought things through and tried to bring some really different views on things as well in series 4. So yeah, it'd be great to have you with us there for that series as well. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us for this particular episode. Really hope you can join us and this amazing guests on our next show. And in the meantime, please stay safe. Many thanks. Bye.